for us to do the story, I need someone to come up here and demonstrate for us a push-up. Come on, Jack, you can do it.
Oh,
You gonna do it? Okay. How many can you do? 30. He says he can do 30 push-ups. Do 30 push-ups. Ah. Don't stop, keep going.
That's team one.
Yeah, when I was in 8th grade, I set the school record by doing 100 push-ups. That's true, I used to do that every night. That's why I'm so good looking. All right, well let me share this story with you, because it is a story of God's grace. There was a certain professor of religion named Dr. Christensen, who taught at a small college in the western United States. Dr. Christensen taught the required survey course in Christianity at this particular institution. Every student was required to take this course, his or her freshman year, regardless of their major. And although Dr. Christensen tried hard to communicate the essence of the gospel in his class, he found that most of his students looked upon the course as nothing but required drudgery. Despite his best efforts, most students refused to take Christianity seriously. This year, Dr. Christensen had a special student named Steve. Steve was only a freshman, but was studying with the intent of going on to seminary for the ministry. Steve was popular. He was well liked, and he was an imposing physical specimen. He was now the starting center on the school football team and was the best student in the professor's class. One day, Dr. Christensen asked Steve to stay after class so he could talk with him. He asked him, "How many push-ups can you do?" Steve said, "I do about 200 every night." 200? That's pretty good, Steve, Dr. Christensen said. "Do you think you could do 300? Steve replied, I don't know. I've never done 300 at a time." "Do you think you could, Doctor?" Again asked Dr. Christensen. "Well, I can try," said Steve. "Can you do 300 in sets of 10? I have a class project in mind, and I need you to do about 300 push-ups in sets of 10 for this to work. Can you do it? I need you to tell me that you can do it." Steve said, "Well, I think I can. Yeah, I can do it." Dr. Christensen said, "Good. I need you to do this on Friday. Let me explain what I have in mind." Friday came, and Steve got to class early and sat in the front of the room. When class started, the professor pulled out a big box of donuts. These weren't the normal kind of donuts. They were the extra fancy big kind with cream centers and frosting swirls. Everyone was pretty excited. It was Friday, the last class of the day, And they were going to get an early start on the weekend with a party in Dr. Christensen's class. Dr. Christensen went to the first girl in the front row and asked Cynthia, "Do you want to have one of these donuts?" Cynthia said yes. Dr. Christensen then turned to Steve and asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Cynthia can have a donut?" "Sure," said Steve. He jumped down from his desk to do a quick 10. Then Steve again sat at his desk, and Dr. Christensen put a donut on Cynthia's desk. Dr. Christensen then went to Joe, the next person, and asked, "Joe, do you want a donut?" Joe said yes. Dr. Christensen asked Steve, "Would you do 10 push-ups so Joe can have a donut?" Steve did 10 push-ups, and Joe got a donut. And so it went down the first aisle. Steve did 10 push-ups for every person before they got their donut. And down the second aisle, till Dr. Christensen came to Scott. Scott was on the basketball team and in as good condition as Steve. He was very popular, never lacking for female companionship. When the professor asked Scott, "Do you want a donut?" Scott's reply was, "Well, can I do my own push-ups?" Dr. Christensen said, "No. Steve has to do them." Then Scott said, "Well, I don't want one yet." Dr. Christensen shrugged and then turned to Steve and asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so Scott can have a donut he doesn't want?" With perfect obedience, Steve started to do 10 push-ups. Scott said, "Hey, I said I didn't want one." Dr. Christensen said, "Look, this is my classroom, my class, my desks. These are my donuts. Just leave it on the desk if you don't want to." And he put a donut on Scott's desk. Now by this time, Steve had begun to slow down a little. And he just stayed on the floor between sets because it took too much effort to be getting up and down. You could start to see a little perspiration coming out from around his brow. Dr. Christian started down the third row. Now the students were beginning to get a little angry. Dr. Christensen asked Jenny, "Jenny, do you want a donut?" Sternly, Jenny said, "No." Then Dr. Christensen asked Steve, "Steve, would you do 10 more push-ups so Jenny can have a donut that she doesn't want?" Steve did 10, and Jenny got a donut. By now, a growing sense of uneasiness filled the room. The students were beginning to say no, and there were all these uneaten donuts on the desks. Steve also had to really put forth a lot of extra effort to get these push-ups done for each donut. There began to be a small pool of sweat on the floor beneath his face. His arms and his brow were beginning to get red because of the physical effort involved. Dr. Christensen started down the fourth row. During his class, however, some students from other classes had wandered in and sat down on the steps along the radiators that ran down the sides of the room. When the professor realized this, he did a quick count and saw that now there were 34 students in the room. That's 40 more push-ups. He started to worry if Steve would be able to make it. Dr. Christensen went on to the next person and the next and the next. Near the end of that row, Steve was really having a rough time. He was taking a lot more time to complete each set. A few moments later, Jason, a recent transfer student, came to the room, was about to come in, when all the students yelled in one voice, "No! Don't come in! Stay out!" Jason didn't know what was going on. Steve picked up his head and said, "No, let him come." Professor Christensen said, "You realize that if Jason comes in, you will have to do 10 push-ups for him?" Steve said, "Yes. Let him come in. Give him a donut." Dr. Christensen said, "Okay, Steve, I'll let you get Jason's out of the way." "Jason, do you want a donut?" Jason, new to the room, hardly knew what was going on. He said, "Yes, give me a donut." "Steve, will you do 10 push-ups so Jason can have a donut?" Steve did 10 push-ups, very slowly and with great effort. Jason, bewildered, was handed a donut and sat down. Dr. Christensen finished the 4th row and started on those visitors seated by the heaters. Steve's arms now were shaking with each push-up and a struggle to lift himself against the force of gravity. Sweat was profusely dropping off of his face. And by this time, there was no sound except his heavy breathing. There was not a dry eye in the room. The very last 2 students in the room were 2 young women, both cheerleaders, very popular. Dr. Christensen went to Linda, the second to last, and asked, "Linda, do you want a donut?" Linda said very sadly, "No, thank you." Professor Christensen quietly asked, "Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Linda can have a donut she doesn't want?"